Right, ladies and gentlemen, there's probably a couple of there may be many questions on your mind, but two of them may be, who is this guy, and what could he possibly have to say that's new about Cambrai? So, introductions. Fraser Skirrow. I'm a battalion historian. My family all come from the West Riding, from Wharfdale years back, and I'm an ex-territorial. So you're probably not overly surprised to discover that I specialise in West Yorkshire territorial battalions. And my life's work has been to persuade every member of the Western Front Association that the Great War was actually won by West Yorkshire territorials and several million support troops. I persevere. I think it's fair to say that there's some work to be done, but that's really what that's your sort of hidden agenda today before we get into this. Now, the other slight difference today is that my speaker's notes are on that computer over there, and not even my varifocals will do it. So occasionally, because there are a lot of numbers in this, I'm going to have to look down at my notes, but I hope you will forgive me. So, we're going to be going into this battle in some detail. And the moment you start going into the detail, you run into trouble. Because you've got a combination of the fog of war at the time and the mists of time since to make the whole thing very, very obscure. And this was the Duke of Wellington's response when somebody wanted to write about the Battle of Waterloo. But we have to sort of brace ourselves and go in there because accounts are inconsistent, timings are inconsistent, and many accounts, once you get deep into them, are actually not truthful. So we've got to unknit all of that as we go through. So let's go now and talk a little bit about Cambrai itself, and then we will run through and look at what the participants expected to happen. Then we'll look at what actually happened as best we can tell, and then see what conclusions we can draw from that. So, in some ways, there's not that much new going on here. The plan for Cambrai is very similar to the plan for Havrincourt that had taken place some months beforehand. A frontline bombardment, a tank attack. Tank attacks are not that new at this point. The 62nd has attacked with tank support at Havrincourt before now. The cooperation between infantry and tanks has actually been reasonably well thought through at this point. And particularly the officers have been off on training courses. This sort of thing is unsurprising. Nipping out a village, yep, tried that before, that's been done. A little bit of fighting in built-up areas. And always, when you're dealing with the Germans, there will be a counterattack. They don't give ground. So you need to get in, reverse the position, take the counterattacks as they come. What could possibly be controversial about such a plan? And yet, both at the time and in all the years since, there are myriad books and articles arguing about what the intentions were and what actually took place. And of course, it gets seized by the advocates of armoured warfare or the traditionalists, and everyone uses this battle to promote their own view. So I think we've got to get back to what happened, where did it happen, and get down into the detail. At this point, my daughter refers to my talks as the Great War, one bullet at a time. I've decided to take that as a compliment. But let's take a little look at what's different. This is about surprise. This is about shock effect. Again, that's controversial. But a huge amount of effort at the time went into making sure that the Germans did not know that an attack was about to take place. And there's a lot of writing about some soldiers who were captured a few days before the attack and the information that they gave. And they said, well, was this truly a surprise? There's also a very different approach to the bombardment. There is not millions of shells going into the wire before this. This is a whirlwind bombardment. It is short, it is intensive, and it takes in not only the front line, but targeted positions behind the line, headquarters, communications, counter-battery fire, very carefully planned to disrupt the ability of the enemy to respond to the attack. And that's been very carefully thought through. Speed. Great War battles are not normally associated with speed and momentum. You know, particularly if you go back to the Somme, it's all happening at the speed of the slowest unit because you've got to keep in line. You mustn't expose your flanks. You must stick to plan. Well, actually, the planning for this one, as you'll see, is very light touch. There are broad boundaries for people to operate in. The orders themselves are very broad. And they are thinking about what could go wrong, not actually planning on the basis that it's all going to go right. Back at Bulcourt, the infantry plans and the tank plans were very separate documents that didn't really gel together. On this occasion, from the very start, the infantry and the tanks will be planning together, and we can prove from some of the documents you'll see that that actually took place. What that gives you is freedom to maneuver within your boundaries and actually, if necessary, outside your boundaries. Because flank protection, which before was you have to advance in line with the other units or your flanks will be left in the air. The assumption here is that your flanks are going to be left in the air and you're going to have to deal with it. So we have got a couple of schools of thought. This is just a development of stuff that was already there, and actually there's something new and subtle and interesting going on. So we need to go and say, okay, what worked, what didn't, and what should we believe? As ever, ground is one of the most important things. So we're going to spend a bit of time on the ground. You're actually about to get a little holiday tour of the village of Havrincourt in late 1917. So, here indeed is Havrincourt. Now we are now 14 miles southwest of Cambrai. The Canal du Nord is up here, and anybody who's driven past this area will know that very frustratingly on the next objective up here, they've banged the service station for the A2. So you may well actually have stopped and had a coffee on the second objective. If you're trying to take atmospheric photographs of a First World War battlefield, and you're in the equivalent of a NAFI, it really does spoil the experience. Let's just take standard British map. The blue line is important because that's an objective line. The green line is not. That's where I stitch the maps together. The town of Havrincourt has got a railway marshalling yard, and right bang in the middle of it, it's got a chateau. And that chateau has this great big park running out in front of it. It has what's called the Grand Ravine. The Grand Ravine is not particularly grand. And it has apparently a very significant water feature in there, which isn't actually very significant either. So the map is a little bit misleading. There's a bit of a dip and it's a bit damp in the bottom. But it's still a fairly important feature because the Germans are entrenched up this way and on the top of the other side, and this is their limit of their outpost line. And as you can see, this is the Hindenburg line. This is very heavily wired and very heavily defended. The ground, however, out on one side is open farmland. And we'll go and take a little bit more of a look at it. So, traditionally, moving left to right. We'll now go to the oblique photographs. Don't you love the Royal Flying Corps? This was taken leaning over the side of a canvas and wood biplane on a camera using glass plate. You can forgive them a lot, really, can't you? So for your reference point, there's the chateau that you saw before with its park here. And you can see the ground here is actually very open. It's been cratered in a number of places, famous names, Vesuvius, Etna, Snowdon, and there's the magnificently named Boggart Hole down here. This area is just to the left of the brigade that we're interested in, but it plays a big role in what happens today. For those of you familiar with the battle, Flesquières, which will also feature, is up there just out of the picture. And there, in the background, is the insidious shadow of Bourlon Wood. Let's move into the center. vertical shot this time. There's the chateau. Now, as you can see, this is February 1917, and the chateau is still intact. Its park here, lots and lots of open ground, with the wooded section here. The area we were looking at before with the marshalling yard is out here. This is in the 187th Brigade area. The 2nd 6th will attack this part, and the 2nd 8th will be attacking over here on the outskirts of Havrincourt. The village, as you can see, is largely intact. The field's largely open, but this is taken too high for you to see the wire. Any Royal Engineers in the room? Okay, the Royal Engineers had a habit of going, setting up cameras on the parapet and taking panoramas. It's a sort of holiday activity for them. And this is the one that they took at Havrincourt a matter of weeks before the battle. So you can see the chateau there, which is rather magnificent. You can see the wooded area of the park itself. What's interesting here is this area where they've knocked the wood down. Now that may not look like much of an obstacle to tanks, but actually, it's not the logs that are the obstacle, it's the stumps. That front underplate on a tank is not particularly thick, and they have a problem with what they call bellying out. So they'll drive onto a stump. The stump will either drive through the armor, or it will raise the tank up to an angle where actually its tracks no longer have traction. So this wood area of felled timber is actually a significant obstacle. If we go slightly right, we've still got the chateau. Now you can see this is our wire, and you can see this is the wood that the 2nd 6th will have to fight in, and here is the town of Havrincourt as we go further right. Now you can start to see some of their second line wire coming down here. Most of their wire is actually out of sight because this down here is the Grand Ravine. Eastern side of Havrincourt, this little area here we will be referring to, it's called the Rose Garden, and that's where battalion headquarters is for the defence of Havrincourt. Further off to the right, the cemetery, the chapel, and Teawood. And this is the area over which the 185th Brigade will fight on the day. And again, more power to the Royal Engineers for these. I mean, if we go back, here are the shovels and rifles of the men who are digging the frontline trench. It's marvellous to have this sort of access to what it was really like, because the first thing you will all have seen, of course, is this ground is not torn up. We are not lip-to-lip shell holes. This is not the Somme. There is no mud. It's all scrub. So, let's talk about some of the people involved. German forces at Havrincourt. The center of the position, actually the whole of this position, is being held by the 84th Infantry Regiment. Now these are very interesting people. They are from Schleswig. I now have to apologize about my German pronunciation as well as my French, which is now part of Denmark, and many of the officers and men were actually Danish speaking. And we owe the Danes a debt on this because they're very interested in the First World War and they've translated a lot of the documents. So this is von Manstein's regiment from Schleswig. They have ended up with a crest that looks like a beer mat. And actually, now that it's on this screen, we can see it has a typo in it because this says von Hanstein and the regiment is actually von Manstein. But then the 62nd Division has ended up with a pelican because by the time you get to 62nd Divisions, all the lions and griffins and dragons are gone, and you end up with a pelican. So there are 3 battalions within the 84th, and 1st Battalion is holding the village itself. And that is run by a captain, a Hauptmann Wille. He has about 800 men, split up into 4 companies and a machine gun company. The southern sector down here, which is the next 4 companies, is run by an officer called Salto, who is, again, a very experienced officer. He was at Verdun, and his experiences there will become relevant later on. 3rd Battalion, under Fraser, is holding the back of the village. 27th Reserve Infantry Regiment isn't actually there. It's a couple of miles further north, and that's the reserve regiment that he can call on. On either side, he has these chaps. These are Landwehr infantry regiments. These are very poor quality troops. It's a combination of a kindergarten and a care home. They're very old troops or very young troops and are really not regarded as terribly reliable. Now, Villers and Soltau in particular had a conference on the 19th of November and discussed what they were going to do. Their intelligence said that there would be an attack. They knew it was coming. They knew it was coming the next day. They believed that this attack would be to nip out Havrincourt. And he was essentially expecting an attack to go this way and an attack to come up this way, or possibly hit the Landwehr, and essentially encircle Havrincourt, a bite and hold operation. So to counter this, he has borrowed a number of machine gun companies from the 27th. He's borrowed machine gun companies from 3rd Battalion, and he's moved them forward into Havrincourt, and then he's moved units of his own out of Havrincourt and into the outpost line. He's also discussed the counterattack plan with the 27th, and he has strengthened his boundaries with 384 because he doesn't trust them. So he is expecting them to collapse, and he is expecting to be attacked from the right as well as the front. He has ordered up as much ammunition as he can, and he has settled in to await the attack. Soltau sees things slightly differently. He doesn't think he's going to be the main focus of the attack. He also has strengthened his boundaries on the right. He's tried to discuss a counterattack plan with the Landwehr, but he hasn't had any response. He has quite a philosophical conversation with his officers, stressing not one pace back. Normally you would expect a flexible front defense, you fall back a little bit, then you kick in with a counterattack. Soltau doesn't believe that. The reason he doesn't believe that is that he was the officer at Verdun who evacuated one of the forts that had been taken from the French, Douarnenez, which was held for 10 months. He evacuated at a time when the French heavies had blasted the roof off his position, his magazine was on fire, and his hospital was under direct shell fire. It was not a dishonorable thing to have done, but he constantly questioned. He was the subject of an inquiry, and he felt very strongly that his integrity had been questioned and that he was someone who was unreliable. The British don't think this is a raid. 6 divisions, several of them not from Yorkshire, are present. 62nd Division is going straight in at Havrincourt. 2 brigades up, 185 on the right, 187 on the left, and support from 58 tanks from GD and E battalions. So there's no way that this is a small nipping out operation. Now, even if Villers had been able to see this plan, while it would have worried him more, it wouldn't have worried him hugely because he knew certain things going into this attack. On the evening before, they got a message that there were tanks coming. He had armor-piercing ammunition. He didn't have enough of it, but he had armor-piercing ammunition, and he ordered more. He knew that these tanks could not sustain attacks from his machine guns with SMK ammunition. He knew that his trenches were too wide for these tanks to cross. He knew that he was probably facing an infantry attack, and if the barrage had not already landed, then the wire was going to be uncut. And he knew above all things that he had time, because he had a fantastic communications network. He had got the 108th behind him at Flesquières. That is an artillery regiment trained in anti-tank work. And he's got another artillery regiment behind that, all of them on call. So he would probably have moved up a few reserves and complained to division. But actually, they were confident that day that they could hold. But the rules have changed. These are extracts from the orders given to the infantry battalions on the day. One of the things about having a typewriter is you can shout on paper. And this is faithfully reproduced, right down to the grammatical errors. There is no excuse for not going forward. If the tanks don't show up, you carry on. You don't wait. Speed with which the operation is carried out. Get them running, keep them running. You don't stop just because you've reached a boundary. You carry on to your front. Flanks. You don't wait for the flanking unit to come up. If there's a gap at a company level, so we're already quite a way down in the hierarchy, you will expand right or left to fill that gap. If you are counterattacked, if the enemy comes back at you in any way, again, at company level, you will instantly organize the attack. You will not wait for orders, you will not wait to report, you will just keep going. So the delegation of authority in this is down to officers who are commanding 100, 150 men. This is new. So, what are the British intentions? On the left, the 2nd 6th. Now, the 2nd 6th has acquired a spare company from the 2nd 5th, and that company is going to move into the outpost line and clear the outpost line. The outpost line has a collection of machine guns in it. Unfortunately, also, this map, which is a map that was used in the planning, is not accurate. That outpost line has got a lot more wire than there is on this map. After the outpost line is taken, C Company and a piece of D will then breach, with the assistance of several tanks, the Hindenburg line just next to the number 34. B and then A companies will move through and they will fight up the Hindenburg line trenches into Havrincourt village, continue through the village to the outskirts at the other side, and that is their day done. The 2nd 8th will go up the other side. Now, we know that that's the map they planned on because this map belongs to a Captain Burrows, and Captain Burrows commands D Company of the 2nd 8th. This is in his personal papers. These are his notes. So, same sort of thing. They have a spare company that will take the outpost line. A will go in, take the Hindenburg line main position. C will take out various of the strong points on the way up, be passed through by B and D, who will take the final objective, meeting up with the 2nd 6th here. I'd also like to point out Triangle Wood, and I think it's on the fold of the paper, here, the boundary with the 51st, because these boundaries will become very important. That's the plan. Well, that's the infantry plan. In an even rarer document in Captain Burrows' papers, and I've only found this in one other place, is this. This is the tank plan overlay for the day. You remember all those felled trees? Well, they're in here. So what's going to happen is that down a trackway next to a wood, trackway about 30 feet wide, are going to process 15 or 16 tanks. They're going to break out here and fan out and go straight up through the frontline German positions. Now that sub-grid square is 500 yards wide, and 15 or 16 tanks are going to go through it in support of the 2nd 8th. On the left-hand side here, these individual tank positions are those who will support the 2nd 6th. As you can see, there's 6 of them, and they will come up in 2 groups, one right and one straight up into Havrincourt Wood. Now, inadvertently, when you think of a mass tank attack, you tend to think of lines of tanks track to track. But because of the nature of the ground, they can't do that. So what they've essentially done is they have invented the armored punch. An awful lot of tanks are going to come out of a very narrow gap on a very narrow front. And that's absolutely critical to what happens this day. For those of you who are into arithmetic, yes, the numbers of tanks on the various sheets do not add up. Also frustratingly, these are all G battalion tanks. The only battalion whose records are missing for this day is G. So, let's go. 0. This is a big and confusing battle. The deeper you get into it, the more confusing it becomes. So we're going to focus on 3 mini battles. We're going to focus on what happens to Soltau's men, these 4 companies over here. We're going to focus on what happens to the 2nd, 6th as they make their way up into the Hindenburg Line and up into the village of Havrincourt. But we're also going to focus on Hauptmann Ville, who is commanding the defense of Havrincourt, and what happens to him and the efforts that he makes to defend it. And that should be enough to test our assumptions about this battle. So, at 0, the barrage falls. It takes in all of the frontline companies. It also takes in Soltau's HQ and Ville's HQ. It takes in at least one of the artillery batteries, and it takes in a lot of apparent communication points. And the first thing that we note is it works. Within the first 15 minutes of this battle, there is 1 telephone line intact. Excuse me. And that runs from Ville to regiment. These companies are out of touch with their own HQ, and they're out of touch with each other. They have light signaling stations, but the morning is foggy and there's a lot of smoke. The light signaling stations don't work. From here on in, the only way that they can communicate with each other and with command is by runner. The bombardment is severe. It starts off with just a few shells. It then moves to drum fire. And the survivors said that it was the most intense bombardment that they ever experienced. Now, these guys were in Flanders and they were at Verdun. They know what the bombardments are like. It was apparently quite extraordinary. And in our lines, a few minutes later, units start to roll. Coily on the left, 2nd, 6th on the left of our brigade, 2nd, 8th on the right. Now, big arrows. Let's break them down a bit. Coily, 4 companies, and 2, 4, 6, 8, yes. Their tank, now that's a little bit friendly because their tanks weren't actually there on time. Any ex-cavalrymen in the room? Okay, we're on camera, aren't we? Okay, the cavalry has a tendency to get up later. They were not on time. But 1, they had orders to go whether the cavalry were there or not. 2, the tanks have runners with them, and if they're going to be late, they send a man to say, we are on our way, we're not lost. So the Coily could kick off and start the battle, even though the tanks were there, and the tanks did actually catch up with them and overtake them. The 2nd, 6th, well, they've got their lone company, and they've got their own companies, and they have got either 5 or 6 tanks, depending on who you listen to. The 2nd, 8th, they've got their extra company, and they've got no tanks at all. And they're not supposed to, because you see this line, trees felled and ground cleared by enemy. If the 2nd, 8th cannot have its tank support with it, its tank support has got to go around the side. So, 6:20, everybody starts to move. And the Coily goes straight up the side and straight through the 1st Hindenburg Line. They take these 4 craters. And because of the area of Havrincourt that they are attacking, they hit mainly Landwehr infantry, who disturbed the attack in its latter stage largely by surrendering in numbers that it's very hard to cope with. But what they also do is they go up the side of the park here. And number 3 company of the 84th, under Lieutenant Anderson, they see this attack go in, and they open fire across the park to try and hit it in the flank. and the Coiley drop off a tank and start up a one-tank barrage on the 3rd. But the critical thing is not the damage they do to the 3rd, it's just that the 3rd has seen about 15 tanks drive unimpeded across their position in front of them, which is really quite a worrying thing to happen to you. The 2nd, 6th make their move, but it doesn't go terribly well because all that wire in this area that isn't on this map stops their outpost line dead. And actually, the company, almost all of the casualties of the 2nd, 5th that day are concentrated in this company. The fight for the outpost line becomes very bitter. The Germans understand that they're under attack, and their outpost line actually falls back in good order. They make it back with their machine guns and with minimal casualties. The 2 tanks that are supposed to crush the wire here don't show up. So C Company actually has to attack the Hindenburg line unsupported by tanks or artillery. It doesn't go very well. And the wire here is so thick that they stop near the pond because they think they're in the main Hindenburg line, but actually they're not. The companies that are supposed to pass through them are obviously stuck as well, no tank support, and can't get through. So this part of the attack in the center gums up. Now, 3rd Company also see these 3 tanks arrive. And they can't work out what these guys are doing because the tanks stop. And after a while, they disappear off to the east. And what this says to 3rd Company is, that was the diversion, wasn't it? Actually, they're going to go round Havrincourt and meet up at the back. The main attack isn't coming through us. So that problem in the center actually fitted with what the Germans thought was going to happen. What they definitely didn't think was going to happen was what happens to Soltau over here. That's what an armored punch looks like. No one's ever seen anything like that before. So let's see what they had to say about it. Just here, on the edge of the wood, is a small track. And at about 6:30 in the morning, a tank came out of it. And Lieutenant Mestbaub of 7th Company received a report from one of his soldiers that said something black was coming. Another report came in that said, there's a house moving towards us. Another said something big and black and square, like a blackboard, is out there. These guys have seen tanks. They've never seen tanks with fascines on. These things are big. Secondly, it's foggy. And they get out and into the ravine, and they're not seen until they're quite close to 7 Company. And he sees 1 tank. Now, he's seen tanks before. And he said later, 2 or 3 tanks, we can cope with this. But they just keep coming. So what did he say? Artillery. That's what we need. He said, we saw 1, we saw 2, we saw 3. They just kept coming. We could see they were coming from one place. It's time for the artillery. Phones are dead. They fire flares. No artillery comes. They send runners. No one comes. The light station won't work. And all the time, at 3 miles an hour, over that 500 yards, the tanks keep coming. His company commander, Maury, completely breaks down. He's slightly wounded. He runs. 7 Company breaks and gets tangled up with 6 Company. And they all basically go back. Now they reach battalion headquarters where Soltau is. And Soltau sees basically an absolutely hysterical company commander in front of him and says, this is stupid, we have to get a grip of this. But other officers come in and say, there is nothing we can do. Hundreds of tanks are reported to Soltau, not dozens. And at that point, They say Soltau cannot cope with this because he simply cannot envisage that an attack this big could possibly be made. Now, over there in 8th Company, Hageman does things differently. You remember that before the battle, some men were captured who divulged the plans for this attack. Hageman was the officer who captured them. Very interesting man. Now, he has a plan. So he mans the fire step, everybody up. And they fire off their SMK ammunition because that stops tanks. These are Mark IVs. The ammunition won't penetrate them. They don't have enough ammunition. They fire all of it off. And at one moment, they think they've got one. It stops dead. And they cheer. And then it drops its fascine into the trench in front of them and drives over the fascine and carries on. And they realize their ammunition won't stop them. Their trenches won't stop them. So they attack with grenades. Now, the stick grenade is an offensive grenade. That stick, bit of whip, you can make it go a long way. But it has half the explosive of a Mills bomb. You're not going to take the track off a tank with an infantry flashbang. So they use their grenades. Grenades don't do anything. And at that point, when he's considering what to do, the Royal Flying Corps strafe him. So what actually happens is that they take enormous numbers of casualties. 3 companies retreat toward Flesquières. Now, why are they doing that? Well, their headquarters is in that direction. But at Flesquières, there's what they call a pioneer park. And the pioneer park has armor-piercing ammunition in it. Also, just behind Flesquières is the 108th Field Regiment of Artillery, trained anti-tank specialists. And the one place infantry wants to be in a tank attack is behind the anti-tank guns. So they run that way. Right across the front of the 51st Highland Division. Now, German accounts are not very good at distinguishing between British soldiers, Canadian soldiers, Australian soldiers, but they know what a kilt is. So we know that those companies were hit by the 51st as they tried to retreat to Flesquières, and it was a soldier of the 51st that killed Harro Soltau that morning. The 8th, so they're out of the battle. The 8th, Hageman's men head back to the village. Don't know why, but he was heading for 1st Battalion, carrying a very important message, which we will come to in a moment. Now, what's happening with the 2nd 6th at this point? They're still stuck. And through the gap go the remaining companies of the 2nd 8th, almost without opposition. Also through the gap goes the 2nd 5th Battalion. Now, they were supposed to be following the 2nd 6th through Havrincourt, but that stuck. Now, back on the Somme, they would have waited. But you remember the orders. If a gap emerges, fill the gap. So they just disappeared off to the right, found some gaps that tanks had made in the wire, and made their way up the side of Havrincourt. Now, the gap gets bigger because over at Triangle Wood, here, that's the other side of the boundary with the 51st. But they hadn't got up there, and the 2nd 8th were attacked from that side. So they go outside not only their battalion boundary, they go outside the divisional boundary and fight it out in Triangle Wood and take it. And they then secure their own flank, because there's nobody on their right, using tanks to move up into this position. The 2nd 5th, they have a little bit of fighting to do round here, because Soltau's battalions have retreated so quickly, they haven't brought their outpost line. So there are still units in the outpost line which get blasted out of the way with rifle grenades. And the 2nd 5th makes its way up. Now remember, the infantry have been walking now for 1 hour and 10 minutes. They've broken a complete Hindenburg line defense system, and they are now 1,500 to 2,000 yards inside the German position in 1 hour. 4 Company here, they can't see behind them. They have no idea that this is happening, so they carry on fighting. But 3 Company, they can see everything. They've seen 15 tanks go up the front. They've seen 15 tanks go around the back, and they know that there's 2 battalions of infantry behind them. They are having a very hot afternoon in morning in 3 Company, and they are very, very worried about it. But there isn't actually a great deal that they can do. The 2nd, 6th, the companies that are stuck behind it, have also disappeared off to the right, found gaps in the wire, and are coming up to drive through that attack. But at 7:30, the critical thing is that breakthrough that we all talk about in First World War time. There will be a breakthrough. That breakthrough is actually happening. Let's skip forward then to 7:30. Let us now pop up to the Rose Garden. Here is Hauptmann Villers. Now, at 6 o'clock in the morning, they shelled him with enormous intensity. And they've also machine gunned him, and he's been buzzed by the Royal Flying Corps. So he's thoroughly aware that something is going badly wrong. At 7:30, at the start of this piece, he actually sees some of the companies falling back past him, because from his position, he can see down the slope, he can see out, he can't see into the village. The barrage is now falling behind him. This barrage doesn't creep, it leaps. Because as we don't know where the advancing infantry are going to be, you have to put the barrage well out. But the fact that it's falling behind him is not a great sign. The Coily have reached their first objective, and they've turned right into the village. They are still sweeping up large numbers of Landwehr, but they're actually starting now to run into the professionals of the 84th. The tanks have now far outpaced their infantry. And they are operating up outside Havrincourt and are actually guarding the flank of the 2nd 8th as they make their way up towards Chapel Wood. Villers can see a lot of this from his position. He's demanding a counterattack. He's trying to get in touch with 3rd Battalion, but he can't get through because that's part of his communication network. He has to phone regiment and get regiment to do all of the work for him. But he is promised that the 27th Reserve Infantry Regiment and other units will come to his assistance. And he gets that promise at 7:30. At 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Dunkelgeld, which translates as the Dark Lord for any Harry Potter fans in the room, he's commanding 3 Company. He gets back to Havrincourt, to the command post, and says 3 Company cannot hold. Now, 3 Company hasn't been attacked by the 2nd 6th yet, so the reason 3 Company cannot hold is it saw the tanks go up the front, it saw the tanks go up the back, and it knows that it's in a pocket that's about to be taken. Remember, they think this is a nipping out operation. So they head for Flesquières, right across the battlefield, because as far as they were concerned, that was still the safer option. And the tanks appeared to have moved on. They didn't know that the tanks for the 2nd objective were just behind. By 8:30, Hagemann arrives from 8th Battalion, 8th Company. And he tells Villers, Battalion Soltau, those companies, have ceased to exist. He also tells Villers that any counterattack that does not involve artillery is suicidal, and that the forces in front of Havrincourt are no longer fighting forces, they are what he calls driven game. So if you imagine for a moment the deer running before the line of beaters, that is what Hagemann, who is no coward, is saying is happening out here in front of Villers' position. The units effectively by 8:30 have broken. So the 2nd 8th, with its tank support, has taken Triangle Wood, has taken the left-hand side of T Wood, and has arrived on its position slightly behind Villers, but out of sight of him. Now by 10 o'clock, the village is holding, the headquarters are holding, but they are rapidly becoming surrounded. The 2nd 8th are spreading out across their position. The Coily have, remember the orders, you extend, The 2nd, 6th are still down in the village. The Coily have extended and joined up with the 2nd, 8th. The first set of objectives have been taken in less than 2 hours. But the fight isn't over. Because at this point, around 10 o'clock in the morning, when Wille is again attacked by the Royal Flying Corps, he sees advancing British troops. They are about 100 yards away. And at this point, a machine gun position just to the side of the Rose Garden and a machine gun position in the eastern side of Havrincourt open fire on those advancing troops. Now, the man's luck is not in that day, because what he's attacked is the 2nd, 5th Battalion. Now, they have so far that day taken Femi Scrub, taken the edge of T Wood in cooperation with a tank, and taken almost no casualties during this. Now, their training regime before they went was designed to deal with a number of situations. 2 of those situations were you are advancing in open country with tank support and you are hit from the flank by a machine gun position. Another scenario was you're hit from the front by a machine gun position. Wille's men have just attacked the 2nd, 5th Battalion in exactly the scenario that they have been training for. Now, because they're moving to their objective, they don't have any tanks at this point. But the orders for the tanks are, after you have achieved your objective, your time is your own. There are no objectives. Go and have fun. Make yourselves useful. So there are tanks randomly roaming round the battlefield, and the 2nd, 5th comes to an arrangement with 2 of them, as you do. They pick up a mail tank, and with Lewis guns and the mail tank, they bombard the position in the edge of Havrincourt. They then charge it, kick the doors in, and take it. The one that's right next to Wille's position, that's in a trench. That's attacked with a female tank, and as far as we can make out, the infantry platoons went in behind, behind the tank, machine guns blazing, drove onto the position, and took the machine gun post. The tank, however, starting to knit our accounts together, moving to the German account, didn't stop. On top of the command bunker for the 1st Battalion, the 84th Infantry Regiment, was a wooden structure which was the battalion day room. It had at least 2 rooms, because in one of the rooms, at around 11 o'clock in the morning, the adjutant was destroying the battalion papers. In the other room was a tank, because it drove from Vida 6 directly into the battalion position. Wille is in the bunker underneath, still organising the counterattack. Absolute chaos is underway at 11 o'clock. The 1st objective tanks have done their job, and they are roaming randomly around. The 2nd objective tanks are now in position way beyond. And the 2nd, 5th, and the 2nd, 7th are moving through in order to get in position for this. And finally, the word comes to Wille in his bunker that the counterattack is coming. And it forms roughly where that tank is on the right. The problem is that the counterattack cannot get into position because there are so many wounded going down the trenches in the other direction that they can't form. So they get up out of the trenches and start to form to attack, to come back over the railway embankment there and join up with the 84th in Havrincourt. While they are forming up, they are hit by track-to-track tanks and 2 infantry battalions in good order going forward. The British records contain no records of a counterattack because they never saw a counterattack. They got over the railway embankment and they saw the milling chaos in front of them, and they just drove straight through it. So you get a scenario at this point where you've got Germans running away to the north and British attacking to the north, and everyone's moving in the same direction, all mixed in together. But for Wille, he finally persuades regiment that he needs to pull out. Part of this is because the regimental second in command, Major Hofmeier, has turned up and been killed. this has clearly affected opinion. So he makes an arrangement with the artillery. What they're going to do is they're going to shoot him out. So they will put a box barrage down around his position, but with the back of it open. That way, he can pull out, and he will have a rear guard. And they put it down. But the battle is moving so fast that at the time they put it down, soldiers probably of the 2nd, 5th, and possibly of the 2nd, 8th are actually on the position. The artillery comes down, everybody jumps into the trenches and takes cover. And then the artillery lifts. And there is a very embarrassing moment when everyone stands up. And there's a certain amount of, well, what do we do now? And at that point, the headquarters of the 84th drops its weapons because they know it's over. Just behind here is what they called the ancestral vault, which was the catacombs in the cemetery, which was the medical station. And this is overrun moments later. And it is interesting that the infantry went down to loot the place, to souvenir is the verb of the time, where they met the medic, chief medic of the 84th, who shouted at them in English that this was a Red Cross installation and that they should leave, which they duly did. Turned around and meekly walked out. It says something about the power of the symbol of the Red Cross, that this is what's happening. So I'm going to flick forward and leave you here with one conundrum. The 2nd, 6th. They've made it into the corner of the village. And they tell us that at 10:15, the village is taken. But division tells us that the chateau isn't taken until 1 o'clock. So what's going on? Well, we have a problem. The chateau is held by 1st Company. In the 90 pages of personal recollection that form the 84th's history, there is no man from 1st Company who was in the chateau who could be found to testify as to what took place. We know that some men of 1st Company ran because Weber saw them. I have been through several hundred prisoner records, and there are men from 3rd Company, 4th Company, 10th Company. There's almost no one from 1st Company. This regiment has not produced its Book of Dead. Most regiments, there'll be a book by company. So we don't know how many died, but there's only 3 ways out of that chateau. You're a prisoner, you're dead, or you fled. Now, 2 days after the battle, they gather the whole of the 84th Infantry Regiment, and it numbers 53 men, so including those on stretchers. So very few fled. We don't know how many died, and there are no prisoners. So either they left a rear guard, and that rear guard fought to a standstill, or most of 1st Company stood and fought in the built-up area and in the chateau. Now, in close quarter fighting, it is extremely difficult to indicate to the enemy that you wish to surrender. No one says anything on either side about what took place in the chateau. I just leave it to your imaginations. So very quickly, ladies and gentlemen, some conclusions. First off, mitigating circumstances. The Germans have got the 84th Infantry Regiment have got poor units around them. They're short of ammunition, and their support units, many of them are not where they're supposed to be. From our point of view, we can only use this slide in York, by the way. For the 2nd, 6th, there's no contingency. If the tanks don't show up, this plan is actually quite fragile. 51st Division have an absolutely appalling day. 62nd break through. There's no ability to maneuver a division in the way that you can maneuver a brigade. And the retreat from Havrincourt actually makes it harder to take Flesquières because the soldiers are retreating in that direction, many of them in good order. But let's look at the hypotheses that we had at the start and see what we can conclude. Surprise and shock. People say, well, they'd seen tanks before. They hadn't seen tanks like these. Was it a surprise? Yes. If you're expecting 1 tank and 15 turn up, that's a surprise. Was it a shock? Look what happened to Lieutenant Moray. Look what Hageman said. They were surprised, they were shocked. There was a huge moral effect. 3 Company ran, not because it lost troops, it ran because of the tanks. They were in front of them and behind them. That's not a good place to be. Did the bombardment work? Yes. Communications are completely cut. This whole battle could have turned on a strong barrage on a 30-foot gap by a wood. If they'd knocked out those 15 tanks as they came out the wood, this would be like the 2nd, 6th all over. It would be a disaster. But actually they couldn't because the comms didn't work. Were they fast? Constantly in this, you can see that German command cannot respond to the speed of this attack. They think they've got time. The counterattacks are late. The decisions to pull back are late. Infantry and tanks are constantly on top of them. There's no space to make a decision. And everywhere in our records, it's you come to a position, you attack it with infantry. If that doesn't go well, you drop back and the tanks do it. The Germans say exactly the same thing. It was incredibly frustrating. They just got the infantry in the wire ready to go. They loose off a few rounds, the infantry had gone. And the next thing they saw was a tank. Freedom to manoeuvre. Boundaries are more for conversation in this battle. Boundaries are the range of my right-hand man and the range of my left-hand man. Flank protection, waiting for units, don't do any of it. And it's clear that in the battle, this is exactly how they fought it. So I think a lot of these factors that say that this is a new style of warfare actually are borne out by the detail not only of what our records say, but far more convincingly by the records of the 84th Infantry Regiment. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of 62nd Division, and unusually on behalf of the 84th Manstein Infantry Regiment, thank you very much.